something quite endearing about Barney Ronay. Maybe it's his boyish good looks or his sarcastic and often peripheral view of football. Either way, he's a fixture that the Guardian readers know and love. His articles will often leave you with a wry smile and a poignant thought, which is possibly the reason that Fabio Capello is taking his book to South Africa. We went to the Guardian offices in King's Cross to get Barney's approach to football and his views on the World Cup.
Well, I guess I came into football journalism from a slightly unusual route. I've had another career before I did this, and I basically started my own website, that's how I got into it, which ran for a few years and became quite popular and was always, it was quite unusual at the time. These days there are loads of websites that take a kind of left field, satirical, piss-taking approach. But at the time it was quite unusual, and I sort of got into it from that point of view. I'd basically always been the sarcastic person at the back of the classroom making stupid remarks. I was probably obsessed with periphery, whereas I should be concentrating on the main issue. I do occasionally find it surprising how obsessed people are with taking football and all sport very seriously, and going down that kind of I am the next Norman Mailer kind of route. Whereas for me, there's always been a great interest in the periphery and in the small details, and I guess I've just carried on with that. From a managerial point of view, it's just very interesting. The whole point of the book is, sort of what do football managers mean? Why are they inflicted on us all the time? In many ways, the managers are the most visible people in football, which is ludicrous. People who know nothing about football know things about football managers, and there's really no reason why they should. These people in padded overcoats are constantly telling us things, and they are simply people who organise football teams, but they seem to have some very important cultural significance, as well as being the fountainhead of how we're supposed to understand the most popular game in the world. And that really interested me, particularly when you look at the historical journey from managers basically being the kind of chairman's fag and his bum boy, an understairs figure who kind of made the tea and booked the train tickets, and suddenly kind of projected onto the world stage, and projecting yourself and being a kind of a recognisable media face is such an important part of the job. It's really quite absurd when you think about it. My favourite manager from pre-modern era is probably from the 1930s, 40s and 50s, Jack Cock, who was Millwall manager for a while. He was fantastic. He was also a music hall singer, a sculptor. He made jazz records. He owned a pub for quite a long time in Covent Garden, was known as a theatrical impresario, and was also just a sort of a very well-known London figure. You don't make them like that anymore. It's sort of interesting. I think at first people didn't really know what to make of Chelsea winning the league, because we felt this was an old team that we knew well, and the sense that nobody spent, teams didn't refresh their squads, and Chelsea just had most in the cupboard. They had the kind of the baked bean player, the tin of, they had the Malouda, who we haven't really got most out of, but he kind of came good this season, whereas perhaps he might have been moved on in another time, but because there wasn't a great deal of money around, their resources were still very strong. But I think that's not fair, actually. I think Carlo Ancelotti's done a really good job. There have been tactical changes. He's tended to play with that diamond in midfield occasionally, and also to attack a lot more. They attack down the flanks a lot more, and they get forward, and they've scored over 100 goals, which is absolutely phenomenal, and also kept 19 clean sheets. Rumours are very interesting, aren't they? It's a very sort of modern phenomenon. This simply didn't exist up until probably about 10, 15 years ago. But it's now a massive part of football. My personal theory is that one of the reasons we're so obsessed with these things is because basically there isn't that much to say about football. It's actually quite a simple game. But the mechanics of what goes on in an actual football match are very blunt. So we're taken up in the periphery. And rumours and all this kind of stuff kind of sweep across it on a daily basis. It's this horrible raging inferno of inanity, which people are still fascinated by. I think it's partly to do with this sort of internet age, where the idea that you can construct a team or pull together some sort of fantasy 11 is really real, and people do that for a kind of hobby. And also people are so aware of what's going on in different leagues now. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I do think Martin Samuel is very good. He generally always tells you something you don't know and sort of gets it right. He's very good. Of our lot, I obviously love Kevin McCarra, and Paul Hayward's very good. It's a very difficult one, really, isn't it? I mean, it depends how you feel. Do you feel like a bit of Jonathan Wilson? Do you want to talk tactics? Do you want to kind of find out about the Slovakian third choice left back, or do you want to read something a little bit more sort of symphonic like Paul Hayward? The good thing is there's a lot of choice there, and it's always much nicer to talk about the people you do like than the people you don't, of course. Something I find particularly interesting is the period at Watford when Elton John was chairman in the late 70s and early 80s. First person ever to do that, I mean, to come in from that world and to spend a lot of money. I mean, he spent something like £3 million in his first decade, which is a hell of a lot of money in those days. Joined forces with Graham Taylor, they became this kind of double act, very close, and he took them out of the fourth division into the first, which is fascinating. What I want to do is write a kind of BBC drama with Michael Sheen as Graham Taylor, but this is obviously still on the back burner at the moment, but you never know. Watch this space.
It's fair to say that The Guardian isn't the most optimistic newspaper when it comes to England's chances this summer. Barney Ronay has gone on record questioning if England winning the World Cup sends out the right message to the footballing world. We went to The Guardian offices in King's Cross to get Barney's memories of the World Cup and who he thinks will win in South Africa.
It was a very funny thing, actually. I mean, I think particularly because of Capello and who he is, the idea that he'd actually read anything or come across or intersect with your life in any way at all is quite funny. I mean, we have this vision of him as this very opaque, austere, august kind of eminence grise. And also, I've always struck me as a slightly pretentious kind of person as well. We hear a lot about his love of art and his abstract expressionism, and he loves his Chagall, and he likes exploring Mexican ruins. And I mean, with all due respect to my book, it's more of a romp than a sweeping historical survey. I kind of like the idea of him reading it absolutely baffled and probably throwing it over his shoulder after about 5 minutes. Well, I mean, he's obviously a brilliant football manager. I mean, management is just about identifying what you've got, being decisive, having a plan and sticking to it, and that's basically what he does. I think he's never been a national manager before, so it's obviously different for him in that way. But the processes are exactly the same. And I have to say, I think managing a tournament is very different to managing in the group stages, which is much closer to a club job. You get your players together, you work with them. It's probably as close as international management gets, whereas a tournament's very different. And it'll be very interesting to see how he varies the 2-year pattern that he set in train over qualification, playing however many games it's going to be in South Africa in such a short space of time. I mean, I think the two most revealing games of Capello's reign have been the game against Spain and the game against Brazil, when England were just totally outplayed. I mean, I think the way they have been playing, it's probably physically impossible for England to beat Spain or Brazil. They play a very rigid system that's not going to surprise anyone, and those teams simply have better players who keep the ball better. England have zero chance of winning the World Cup unless they get a very more bizarrely easy draw. It's very, very hard to see them beating particularly those two teams in a one-off game. They were absolutely destroyed by Spain on the night. We had Michael Carrick playing in midfield against Xavi, and you really saw the difference between the two teams. I mean, Carrick's a good player, but Xavi's the master of what Carrick tries to do. And you just thought, well, there's absolutely no way England can possibly beat this team. They won't give us the ball, which is what England rely on. And I think England will probably reach the quarterfinals, as they always do. No disgrace in that. They're probably in the top 12 teams in the world, so that will suit them. My first memory is probably the '86 World Cup. I didn't watch the first game, which they lost to Portugal, which was baffling that England had somehow lost an international game. My first real memory is, bizarrely enough, the Morocco game. I remember, even as a very small child, being incredibly disappointed in Glenn Hoddle and just having the feeling he was terribly ineffectual, and knowing even then with a terrible sense of certainty that this was a luxury player. I was very disappointed. I actually cried after the 0-0 draw with Morocco in 1986. England was still in the tournament. It was a particularly bizarre reaction, but somehow it seemed crushing at the time. And I sensed, I think, a lifetime of futility stretching ahead of me, even as a very small boy. And of course, I remember the Poland game after that, which Gary Lineker's hat-trick. particularly remember Jimmy Hill on co-commentary absolutely whooping with delight as Lineker scored. It seemed somehow wrong. I couldn't imagine that you were actually allowed to do that, but he did anyway, and that was a great moment and a brilliant performance as well. It's very hard to say, isn't it? One thing that seems to have happened in the last few years is teams don't necessarily rely on forwards to score a lot of goals, and there are a lot of goal-scoring midfielders, and we could possibly see something like that in this World Cup. This is the beauty of the World Cup. You really don't know. It's such a compact and fast tournament. I think what most people would like to see is African countries doing well in their first World Cup. There's no particular reason to suspect that African countries should do much better. I mean, Ghana and Ivory Coast are probably the best of the lot, but potentially they'll be inspired by being on their home continent, and there's definitely a lot of pride about that. And it would be wonderful to see an African semi-finalist at least. So that's what I'd like to see. But I don't necessarily want to see. We always get a lot of call for more goals. I've seen Sepp Blatter to more goals and more attacking football. I don't necessarily share that. I mean, I kind of quite enjoy I like my football to be quite physical. I like to feel it's a proper contest. It's a contact sport, and I'd like to see some quite lenient refereeing in that sense. You know, I want to see two teams going out there and playing a physical game, and I don't mind a keenly fought 1-0 if you get a feeling there's something really going on in this game. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love about the World Cup is that it's one of the few occasions where football absolutely makes sense. I mean, in many ways, that the club game doesn't really have any meaning anymore beyond money. I mean, money has ruined a great many things in football, and it's ruined this sense that what you're watching is two systems ranged against each other, like an entire culture which is being expressed through that club. I mean, this used to be the way when you saw teams playing in Europe. You'd see the way in which, say, even teams from behind the Iron Curtain competed against Western European teams. But that doesn't happen in football anymore. Certainly in European football, it's totally multicultural, which is a good thing, and you see wonderful team building, you'll see wonderful games, but you don't get that sense of an entire culture being tested. How do we produce football players? Which is what you do get at the World Cup, which is basically still an incredibly limited competition. There's nothing you can do. These are your players, and that's the hand you're dealt. And it's fascinating to see who comes out on top in that situation, and to be able to sort of extrapolate from that. And it's only really the World Cup that offers us that. And that's one of the greatest things about sport. It's what most of the literature around sport is based around, the kind of larger story that we're seeing here. Well, I think either Spain or Brazil will win the World Cup. Spain because they have the best players and they have a brilliant system, but they don't have a history in that. There's always a chance they'll slip up, and they might lack a little bit in physical power. Brazil because they're very good at winning World Cups, and that team is really strong.